The blizzard did not arrive. It simply consumed. One moment, the Colorado borderlands were a study in gray and white. The next, the world had vanished into a churning vortex of wind and snow. For James Jim Cutter, this was not an adversary. It was an old, familiar acquaintance. The wind that howled through the San Juan pines spoke a language he understood, its voice as lonely and unforgiving as the one in his own soul. He leaned forward in the saddle, his body a bulwark against the gale. His horse, Mikulasianetron, Sionishomainonon, a gray gelding named Ghost for its ability to move silently through the forest, labored through the mounting drifts. 40 years of life had carved Jim into a man who fit this landscape. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder sorrows, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and his silence was a fortress he had built brick by brick over a decade. He was returning to his remote trapping cabin, a place more home to him than the sprawling ranch house he had abandoned years ago. The ranch was a place of ghosts and memories. The cabin was a place of stark, clean solitude. He was thinking of nothing but the warmth of a fire and a cup of scalding coffee when he heard it. At first, it was just a thread of sound, so thin he thought the wind was playing tricks on him, weaving phantom noises into its ceaseless roar. He rode on, dismissing it. The high mountain passes were full of strange echoes, the cries of cougars sounding like women, the moaning of wind and rock sounding like a soul in torment. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. But then it came again. It was higher this time, sharper, and it cut through the storm's howl with the unmistakable timbre of human despair. It was the cry of a child. Jim pulled Ghost to a dead stop, the horse grateful for the respite. He tilted his head, listening, his entire being focused on that one impossible sound. In this white hell, miles from any settlement, a child's cry was not just a sound, it was a sacrilege. It was a life where no life should be. The fortress of his silence cracked. A memory, sharp and jagged as a shard of ice, tore through him. Another cry. In another storm, a storm of fists and whiskey inside a dusty Kansas farmhouse. His sister, Elspeth and Hashawasham, her face bruised but her voice defiant, telling him everything was fine. Ifwatiki Karashishian, a boy of 16, had believed her because he wanted to. He had left her there. He had found out about her death a year later from a tattered letter. And at her graveside, a small Uwatan Tunashurd Pintaranashurn, neglected plot of land. He had made a silent vow, a promise to a ghost that he would never again turn away from a cry in the dark. Hub, he grunted, turning Ghost's head. He left the faint trail that led to his cabin and pushed into the deeper, untracked snow, guided only by that desperate, intermittent sound. The search was a blind testament to his woodsman's skill. He moved between snow-laden spruce, their branches so heavy they drooped to the ground, creating pale, silent caves. The wind tore at him, trying to erase the sound, to confuse his direction, but the vow he had made was stronger than the storm. He pushed on, his eyes scanning every shadow, every drift. He found her curled behind a massive fallen log, a small hollow that offered the barest protection from the wind's fury. She was a tiny bundle of misery, wrapped in two thin, threadbare blankets that were now stiff with ice. Her face was deathly pale, her lips a frightening shade of blue. She was shaking so violently it seemed her small body might tear itself apart. Jim swung down from the saddle, his movements swift and sure. He knelt in the snow beside her, his large frame shielding her from the worst of the wind. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, intentionally stripped of any emotion that might frighten her more. "Where's your mum?" "Nemesis Harananton, little one." "Why no one I want?" The girl's eyes, wide and the color of deep water, snapped open. They locked onto his face. Her teeth were chattering too hard for her to speak at first, but she managed to force out a whisper, the words tumbling out on a puff of white air. "Please, don't hurt her." The plea hit Jim harder than the wind. This child, freezing to death. Her first thought was to protect someone else. The memory of Elspeth came again, so sharp it made him wince. He's a good man. Jimmy, he just has a temper. Jim swallowed the lump of grief and fury in his throat. "No one's going to hurt anyone," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He unclasped the heavy, oilskin-lined wool cloak from his own shoulders. It was his last defense against the cold. But that didn't matter. "Let's get you warm first." He wrapped the cloak around her, his large Asian, calloused hands gentle as he tucked the edges in. Her body was almost weightless, a fragile bird in his arms. The moment the heavy warmth of the wool hit her, she let out a small, broken whimper and her tiny, frozen hands clutched at the front of his coat with surprising strength, burrowing into his warmth as if trying to crawl inside his very skin. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her easily. "Lily," she mumbled, her voice muffled against the rough fabric of his coat. "My name's Lily." Um, mm, Narrated. "Lily," he said, settling her in the saddle before mounting behind her. "Let's get you out of this storm." He wrapped his arms around her, pulling the cloak tighter, creating a cocoon of his own body heat. He turned Ghost back the way they came, toward the promise of his cabin, his hands, which could skin a buck or set a trap in the dark without a single tremor, were not quite steady. Lily pointed a small, mittened hand, her voice a little stronger now. "Mama, she fell, back there." Pimenta wanted her. Jim followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing. He could just make out a faint disturbance in the snow, a trail leading away from the log. It wasn't just a trail, it was a story. He could see the small, stumbling footprints of the child beside the larger, dragging tracks of an adult. The story was one of a mother carrying her child, pushing through the storm until her own strength gave out. She had found a place for her daughter to hide, told her to stay put, and then tried to go on, perhaps to find help, or perhaps just to draw death away from her child. "Stay here," he murmured, though Lily was in no condition to go anywhere. He slid from the saddle. The snow now past his knees, and pushed forward. Following the tragic trail, it was a slow, grim march. The tracks grew more erratic, weaving through the trees, a testament to a body at the end of its endurance. He found her 20 yards away. At the base of a rock outcrop, she had collapsed into a snowdrift, half buried, one arm flung out as if reaching for something that wasn't there. She was curled on her side, facing away from the wind. A last, instinctual act of self-preservation. Jim knelt beside her, brushing the snow from her face. Her skin was flushed with a dangerous, feverish heat that was the cold's last cruel trick before it claimed a life. Her lips were cracked and blue, just like her daughter's. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and her dark hair was matted with ice. He placed 2 fingers on her neck. The pulse was there, frantic, thready beat, a desperate drum against the encroaching silence. As if feeling his touch, her eyes fluttered open. They were the same deep water blue as her daughter's, but they were clouded with pain and confusion. Her lips moved, forming a single, rasping word. "Lily!" "She's safe," Jim said, his voice low and immediate. "She's warm, waiting by a fire." It was a lie. The fire in his cabin was long dead, but it was a necessary one. It was the only medicine he had to give. At the news, a profound shudder racked her body. It was the tremor of a soul that had been holding on by a single thread and was finally letting go. A soft, broken sob escaped her lips, and her eyes slid closed again. She had done her part. She had gotten her child to safety. She could rest. Jim did not waste a moment. He gathered her into his arms. She was as light as her daughter, a weightless burden of bone and courage. Cradling the unconscious woman against his chest, he trudged back through the deep snow to his horse. Getting them both on Ghost was a difficult, clumsy affair, but he managed it, settling Clara in front of him, her head lolling against his shoulder, with Lily tucked securely between them. He wrapped the remains of his cloak around all 3 of them, a small, desperate island of humanity against the raging storm. He urged the horse onward, his jaw set in a grim line. The wind tore at them, trying to rip his precious cargo from his arms. But Jim Cutter held fast. The promise he had made to his dead sister had now taken on a living, breathing form. He had failed Elspeth, but he would not fail these 2. He would carry them through this storm, or he would die with them in the all-consuming white silence of the mountains. The cabin door slammed shut against the howl of the blizzard, plunging the small room into a sudden, shocking silence. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged gasp of 3 sets of lungs, a desperate chorus against the dark. Jim Cutter didn't waste a second. He moved with the grim purpose of a man who knew that survival was a race measured in minutes. He gently laid the unconscious woman, Clara, on his own narrow cot. Covering her with a thick wool blanket, he settled her daughter, Lily, on the worn bearskin rug before the cold stone hearth. Then, Hanrasurin Itermason. His attention turned to the fire. His hands, Sushamanamoins, though numb, Paniwak worked with a familiar Hananami, near practiced skill. He shaved tinder, stacked kindling, and struck a match. A tiny flame sputtered to life, a fragile defiance against the oppressive cold. Jim shielded it, nurtured it, and within minutes, a steady fire was crackling, pushing back the shadows and throwing a warm, dancing light across the log walls. He worked silently, stripping the frozen boots from their feet and setting a kettle of snow over the growing flames to boil for tea. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but this was different. The presence of the two helpless figures filled the space, transforming his stark sanctuary into a makeshift infirmary. Clara woke slowly, drawn from the depths by a spreading warmth and the scent of pine smoke. Her first conscious thought was a jolt of pure, animal panic. Lily, her eyes flew open. She was in a small, dark room lit by a blazing fire. She saw her daughter first, cocooned in blankets on a rug, sleeping peacefully. A wave of relief so profound it left her dizzy washed over her. Only then did she see the man. He was a large, silent figure standing by the fire, his back to her, his shoulders broad as an axe handle. He must have sensed her movement, because he turned his head. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were unreadable. He held no threat, but no welcome either. They simply watched. Where is her? She managed to walk in her show, her voice a dry rasp. My cabin, he answered, his voice a low baritone. You're safe from the storm. He ladled a steaming, fragrant liquid into a tin cup and crossed the room. He stopped a respectful distance from the cot and held it out. Pine needle tea. It's warm. She hesitated, her life having taught her that kindness from strange men was a debt she couldn't afford. But she was freezing, and the steam from the cup was a promise of life. She reached out a trembling hand and took it. As she drank, she noticed him look at her, his gaze briefly dropping to the yellowing bruise on her cheekbone before returning to the fire. He didn't comment, but she knew he had seen it, had cataloged it along with the torn dress and her exhausted fear. He saw more than a woman caught in a storm. The hours that followed passed in a thick, watchful silence. Jim moved about the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking the bar on the door, oiling a rifle, adding wood to the fire. He left a bowl of broth and a piece of hardtack on a stool beside her cot. He never spoke unless spoken to, and he never pressed her for her story. His silence was a strange kind of gift, a space for her to simply breathe without the need for explanation or defense. She rested, her eyes rarely leaving him, trying to solve the puzzle of this grim gentleman. The next morning, the fury of the storm had eased, replaced by the steady, hypnotic fall of heavy snow. The world outside the single window was a formless white. Lily awoke with the startling resilience of a child. The terror of the blizzard was forgotten, replaced by a wide-eyed curiosity about the new, warm world she found herself in. She watched Jim as he stirred a pot of cornmeal mush over the fire. Then, she slid off the rug, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She padded over to the large man and tugged on the hem of his buckskin trousers. Jim stopped stirring and looked down. Slowly, deliberately, he knelt, folding his large frame until his eyes were level with hers. He made himself smaller, less of a mountain, more of a man. When he won for me, Lily leaned in, her small face a mask of solemn purpose. She whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Please marry my mama, Mr. Finir de Winterworn. Jim froze, the spoon held motionless in his hand. The simple, childish words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She's all I have now. Lily finished them, a tremor in her voice. Wasm. From the cot, Clara heard it all. A hot flush of shame and horror burned its way up her neck. Lily, she gasped, her voice sharp with panic. Hush now. You must not say such things. But the child's plea hung in the air. Irrevocable. It was not a game. It was the desperate, brutally logical prayer of a child who understood the world in its most basic terms. They were alone and weak, and this man was strong. Therefore, he must be made to stay. The request tore through the years of solitude Jim had carefully constructed around himself. It was a direct appeal to a part of him he thought long dead, the part that had failed to protect his sister. He did not look at Clara. He kept his gaze locked on Lily's frightened, hopeful eyes. He raised a hand, a large, calloused hand that knew the weight of an axe and the trigger of a rifle, and placed it gently on the crown of her head. It was not a gesture of agreement, but of acknowledgement, a silent message that he had heard her, that he understood the weight of her words. Then he stood up, his movements stiff. He turned back to the stove and resumed stirring the mush as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The air in the cabin was now thick with a new and terrifying complication. He had pulled a woman and child from a blizzard, a simple act of human decency, but a child's whisper had just asked him to save their lives. The blizzard broke on the third day. The wind's howl gentled to a whisper, and a pale, watery sun revealed a world transformed, buried under a deep shroud of white. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled, one far more complex than the silence of the storm. It was a silence thick with unspoken questions, with the echo of a child's impossible plea. A fragile routine had formed out of necessity. Jim would rise first, rekindle the fire, and cook a simple breakfast of cornmeal or bacon. Clara, now strong enough to move about the small room, would tend to Lily, her movements quiet and deliberate. She would tidy the small space, fold the blankets, and wash their few utensils with a desperate need to contribute, to prove she was not merely a burden. They moved around each other like cautious animals, never speaking of the future, nor of the past. The elephant in the room was Lily's whispered request, an idea so absurd and yet so potent that neither adult dared to acknowledge it. Jim found himself watching them. He watched the way Clara's hands, though trembling slightly, were endlessly gentle with her daughter, brushing her hair, humming a low tune. He saw the way Lily would look at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, her eyes full of a hopeful, questioning gravity. He was no longer just a rescuer. In the child's eyes, he had become a candidate. The thought was a disquieting warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a decade. It was mid-morning when the sound came. It was not the sound of the wind or a branch cracking under the weight of snow. It was the rhythmic, deliberate crunch of hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving with a purpose that did not belong in this isolated wilderness. Jim was on his feet in an instant. His calm, watchful demeanor vanished, replaced by the sharp, cold focus of a man who knew the language of danger. "Get back," he said to Clara, his voice a low command. Away from the door, Clara's face went white. She grabbed Lily, her arms wrapping around the child like a shield. She had been living in a fragile bubble of safety, and that sound, the sound of the world finding her, was the needle that pierced it. She retreated to the far corner of the cabin, pulling Lily with her into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jim moved to the heavy wooden door, pulling his Colt revolver from its holster with a smooth, practiced motion. He didn't stand in front of the window, but to the side, peering through a small gap in the frame. 3 riders were approaching through the trees. They were not drifters. Their gear was too good, their horses too well fed. They moved with a tight, professional confidence that spoke of a singular, paid purpose. Bounty men. He slid the Colt back into its holster, his face a hard, unreadable mask. This was not a fight to be won with a gun. Not yet. He unbarred the door and stepped out onto the small porch, pulling the door halfway shut behind him. He stood there, solid and unmoving as a mountain, as the riders pulled up just beyond the cabin's clearing. The leader was a man with a slick, handsome face that was spoiled by cold eyes. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of mock civility. "Morning," he said, looking for a man named Cutter. "Dosher, what's a rare worm?" "You found him," Jim said, his voice flat. "Name's Clay. We're tracking a fugitive," the man said, getting straight to the point. He reached into his coat and produced a rolled piece of paper. He unfurled it with a snap. It was a wanted poster. Even from the porch, Jim could see the crude sketch of a woman with dark hair and wide eyes. A woman named Amelia Shaw, murderess, fled from Sville after killing her husband. "There's a $500 reward." Jim's expression did not change. His gaze remained locked on the leader, betraying nothing. Clay's smile was thin. "We heard tell she came this way, a woman and a child. You wouldn't have seen anyone like that, would you?" Lost in the storm, behind him, Jim could feel the weight of Clara's terror. He could almost hear her heart beating. This was the moment. The choice was simple and stark. He could tell the truth, hand over the woman and child, and return to his quiet, empty life. Or he could stand his ground. He saw his sister's bruised face. He heard a child's whisper by the fire. The choice wasn't a choice at all. "You're too late," Jim said, his voice ringing with a cold finality that made the bounty hunters shift in their saddles. Clay's eyebrow went up. "Too late. How's that?" "That warrant is for a woman named Amelia Shaw," Jim said, taking a deliberate step forward, off the porch and onto the snow-packed earth. "No woman by that name lives here. Don't play games. Haruwanti yawash, estermornon. Kurdi, tekun moini cutterin." Clay warned, "Wahani rilawanurnon." His hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "I'm not," Jim said. He reached into his own coat, his movements slow and deliberate. The bounty men tensed, but he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a blank marriage license form he'd had for years in a lockbox, a relic from a time before his world had ended. He'd filled it in last night by the fire, the sleeping child's words echoing in his head. "The woman you're looking for doesn't exist anymore," Jim stated, his voice like stone. "Her name is Amelia Cutter now. She's my wife." He held up the paper. The lie was audacious, insane, but he delivered it with such unshakable conviction that it created a moment of doubt. Clay stared at the paper. "There's a one-on-one." Then at Jim's implacable face, he spat into the snow. "You married a wanted killer. I married a woman who needed protection." Jim corrected him. "And under the law of this territory, my wife is under my protection, on my land. Your warrant is void. You want her. You'll have to go back to a judge and get a new one issued for Amelia Cutter, and you'll serve it to me." The three men exchanged uneasy glances. The situation had changed. This was no longer a simple matter of grabbing a lone woman. It was now a legal confrontation with a landowner on his own property, a man who clearly had no intention of backing down. $500 was a lot of money, but it wasn't worth dying for in a protracted gunfight over a legal technicality. Clay held Jim's gaze for a long moment, his mind calculating the odds. Finally, he sneered, crumpling the wanted poster in his fist. "You've got a lot of nerve. I'll give you that." He shoved the paper into his coat. "This ain't over," he snarled. "We'll be back, and we'll have the right paper next time. You just bought yourself some time. That's all, much." "Time's enough," Jim said quietly. With a final hateful glare, Clay wheeled his horse around, and the three men rode back the way they came, their confidence replaced by a simmering frustration. They disappeared into the trees, leaving only the churned snow and a thick, ringing silence behind them. Only when they were truly gone did Jim allow himself to breathe. He turned and looked back at the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. Clara stood in the opening, her face a mask of utter, stunned disbelief. She was looking at him, then at the false marriage license still clutched in his hand, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. He had stood between her and the world. He had claimed her. He had wrapped her in a lie so bold it was almost the truth. And now, that lie hung between them in the cold morning air, a dangerous, fragile, and terrifying new foundation for whatever was to come. The departure of the bounty hunters brought no relief. It left a silence in the clearing heavier and more suffocating than the snow. The hoof prints of their horses were wounds in the white, a reminder that the world, with all its malice, now knew where to find them. Jim Cutter stepped back into the cabin. Barring the door, the heavy thud of iron echoed in the small room. He turned to face Clara. She stood in the corner, clutching Lily, her face a pale mask of shock. Her eyes were fixed on the folded paper he still held. The lie, the impossible lie he had just told. "Why untold?" she whispered, the single word brittle as ice. It was not a question of gratitude, but an accusation. Why would you do that? He had expected fear, perhaps tears. He had not expected the flash of anger in her eyes. She saw the lie not as a shield, but as another kind of cage, one he had just locked her into. "It bought us time," he said, his voice flat and practical. He walked to the shelf where he kept a few worn books and tucked the false marriage license inside a copy of an old almanac. He was hiding it, but it felt like burying it. That's the only currency that matters now. You've made me your wife in a lie, she said, her voice trembling. You've tied yourself to a fugitive. They will be back. They will ruin you. They can try, he said, turning to face her. The hardness in his eyes was not directed at her, but at the world that had sent those men. They won't get past that door again. I give you my word. His certainty did little to soothe her. The cabin, in Near-Sermon, once a sanctuary, now felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of their new, shared secret. The day passed in a strained, humming tension. Jim chopped firewood with a ferocity that was unsettling. Each swing of the axe, a release of some cold fury. Clara stayed inside, pacing the small floor, her mind a whirlwind of fear. She had run for months, relying only on herself. Now her fate was inexplicably bound to this silent man who had just risked everything for her. That evening, as the fire burned low, the dam of their silence finally broke. Jim sat across from her at the small table, cleaning his revolver with methodical movements. They'll go to the nearest town, he said, not looking up. Yeah, they'll talk sooner or later. A lawman will ride out here. Before he does, I need to know the truth, all of it. His gaze lifted, meeting hers, not because I don't believe you, but because I need to know exactly what kind of lies I'll have to tell. Clara stared at him, her throat tight. He was offering her a choice. Trust him with the story that had nearly gotten her killed. Or remain silent. She looked at Lily, sleeping peacefully by the hearth. And her daughter's innocent faith in this man made her decision for her. His name was Harold Shaw, she began, her voice a near whisper. His family is the most powerful in Esville. They own the mill, the town in Miwaniwon. Nah, I was a school teacher. When he courted me, I thought I was lucky. She described the early charm that masked a chilling possessiveness. Then came the first slap, followed by apologies and expensive flowers. She told him of the slow, insidious poison of his abuse, the insults that chipped away at her soul, the bruises she covered with high-collared dresses, the isolating jealousy that severed her from her friends. I told myself it was the liquor, she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. I told myself if I were a better wife, a quieter wife, he would be a better man. But after Lily was born, it got worse. He was angry about the noise, about the attention she needed. He saw her as my flaw. Jim stopped cleaning his gun. He sat perfectly still, listening. His silence was a vast, steady space for her to pour her story into. The night it happened, she continued, her voice dropping lower. He had been drinking. He came after Lily because she was crying. I stepped between them. He threw me against the wall. I hit my head. When I came to, he was standing over me, his face inhuman. I knew he was going to kill me. He was going to kill us both. Her hand trembled. The pistol was on the mantel. His suoum. I had never fired a gun in my life. I grabbed it. I screamed at him to stop. He laughed and came at me. I closed my eyes and I pulled the trigger. She fell silent, the memory hanging in the air. His brother is the sheriff, she finally whispered. There was never going to be a trial, just a rope. I took Lily and whatever money I had, and I ran. I've been running ever since. When she finished, she felt hollowed out. She braced herself for his judgment, for the flicker of disgust in his eyes. Instead, he stood, walked to the hearth, and poured 2 cups of coffee. He placed one in front of her before resuming his seat. My sister's name was Elspeth. Hishashowi, he said, his voice quiet. Clara looked up, startled. She married a man everyone respected, a blacksmith. It's just a rare one. He continued, staring into his cup as if seeing a ghost. He had a temper, sent her flowers after giving her a black eye, told everyone she was clumsy. His jaw tightened. I was young, working a cattle drive up in Montana. I didn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. When I came back, she was gone. They said she'd had a bad fall, tripped at the top of the stairs. He finally looked at Clara, and she saw a pain in his eyes so profound it was like looking into a grave. At the funeral, I saw the way the women in town wouldn't look her husband in the eye. I saw the truth they were all too scared to speak. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. I believe you, Clara. Every word, because I failed to believe her. And I have spent 15 years living with the knowledge that my silence helped kill her. The confession was a raw, unvarnished offering. He was not just giving her his belief, he was giving her the broken pieces of his own past. He was showing her his scars. In that moment, the fake marriage license tucked away in a book became meaningless. A truer bond had just been forged in the firelight. A pact between two survivors who recognized the same wounds in each other. They were no longer a man, a woman, and a child caught in a storm. They were a fragile lorn and mirna memory, a reader miedo, fractured and fiercely determined new thing. They were a conspiracy, and they would face whatever was coming for them. Together, a week passed, and a fragile sense of normalcy began to take root in the small cabin. The world seemed content to forget them, leaving them to the rhythm of melting snow and the lengthening days of spring. The lie they had told, the false marriage license tucked away in a book, became a silent testament to the pact between them. It was a fiction that had paradoxically allowed a fragile truth to grow. This truth was visible in the small, unguarded moments. It was in the way Lily would now run to Jim when he returned from checking his trap lines, her small hand fitting confidently into his. It was in the way Clara no longer flinched when he moved suddenly. Her shoulders relaxed as she cooked over the hearth. It was in the comfortable silence that settled between them in the evenings, a silence no longer born of caution, but of companionship. One afternoon, Jim sat on the porch steps, teaching Lily how to carve a simple bird from a piece of soft pine. Clara watched them from the doorway, a ghost of a smile on her lips as she listened to her daughter's delighted laughter, mixed with the low rumble of Jim's voice. In that moment, the cabin was not a sanctuary from a storm, but a home. The peace was so profound it felt breakable, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. The sound that broke it was the arrogant, heavy tread of a single, powerful horse. It was different from the cautious approach of the bounty hunters. This rider came with no stealth, crashing through the trees as if he owned the forest itself. Jim was on his feet instantly, placing Lily behind him. His hand didn't move to his gun, but his entire body became a shield. A man on a magnificent chestnut stallion emerged into the clearing. He was dressed in a fine leather coat and polished boots that were absurdly out of place in the muddy wilderness. His face, handsome in a cruel way, was shadowed by the brim of an expensive hat. He pulled the horse to a halt, the animal dancing nervously. Sensing its rider's coiled rage, Clara's breath caught in her throat. A single name escaped her lips like a prayer of dread. Elias Serbuenafonas. It was the brother of her dead husband. He surveyed the scene, the humble cabin, the quiet man. The woman he considered a runaway piece of property, and a sneering smile twisted his lips. Well, Amelia, Tussoy, he called, his voice dripping with condescension. He refused to use her chosen name. I see you found yourself quite the cozy little den, playing house with the hired help. Jim stepped forward. This is my property. State your business and be on your way. Elias dismounted, his movements slow and theatrical. My business is with her. She is a Shaw, by marriage and by law. She will be returning to Esville to face justice for what she did to my brother. She's a cutter now, Jim said, his voice a low, flat warning. The law has no claim on her here. Elias laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A piece of paper you scribbled in a shack. You think that means anything? She belongs to us. Her child belongs to us. The name Shaw is not something you can just wash off in a creek. He took a step toward the porch, his eyes locking on Clara. You are coming with me. Now, Westbury. She's not going anywhere, Jim said, blocking his path. That was all it took. Elias swung. He was not a brawler, he was a bully, and his rage was his primary weapon. The punch was a wild, powerful hook that caught Jim on the side of the head, sending him stumbling back. Jim shook his head to clear it, tasting blood. He recovered his footing and met Elias's next charge. Not with rage, but with a cold, focused economy of motion. They grappled in the muddy yard, a brutal dance of violence. Elias was bigger, heavier his blows fueled by years of arrogant fury. Jim was quicker, smarter, his strength honed by a life of hard labor. He ducked under a wild swing from Elias and landed 2 hard punches to the man's ribs, forcing a grunt of pain. But Elias was relentless. He drove Jim backward. Tackling him to the ground, they rolled in the dirt and mud, fists flying. Elias fought without honor, his thumb gouging at Jim's eye. Jim slammed the heel of his palm into Elias's nose, rewarded with a satisfying crunch and a howl of pain. He pushed the bigger man off and scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. Elias rose, blood streaming from his nose, his face a mask of pure hatred. "You'll die for touching me, you backwoods peasant!" He roared and charged again. This time, he caught Jim off balance. A powerful blow to the stomach, doubling him over. As Jim gasped for air, Elias kicked his legs out from under him. Jim fell hard, his head striking a rock half buried in the mud. The world exploded in a flash of white, then swam back into a blurry, gray focus. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving. A triumphant, savage grin on his bloody face. He raised his heavy boot, intending to stomp down on Jim's throat. "Num." The voice was not Clara's. It was a high, unanas, piercing shriek. Lily, her face streaked with tears, ran from the porch. A tiny, fearless fury, she threw herself between the two men, her little arms spread wide, her body shielding Jim's fallen form. "You leave my papa alone," she screamed, her small body trembling but her eyes blazing with a courage that was immense. Elias froze, his boots still raised. He stared down at the child as if she were an apparition. The raw, discerning absolute conviction in her voice. Her use of the word papa has momentarily stunned him, breaking through his red haze of rage. That moment was all Clara needed. While Elias was distracted, she had moved. She darted back into the cabin and emerged a second later. Not with a pistol, but with Jim's heavy, double-barreled shotgun. She didn't hesitate. She cocked both hammers, the two sharp clicks cutting through the air with terrifying finality. Elias's head snapped up. His eyes widened as he saw her. The terrified, fleeing woman was gone. In her place stood a creature of pure, protective fire, her face set like granite. "Get off my land," Clara said, her voice low and shaking with adrenaline, but absolutely clear. Elias took a hesitant step back from Jim. "You wouldn't dare." "My Sarno," he sneered, but the confidence had vanished from his voice. "Try me," she answered. She didn't aim at him. She aimed at the ground just beside his feet. Then she pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening. It tore through the quiet valley, a roar of defiance that sent birds scattering from the trees a mile away. Dirt and mud erupted where the buckshot hit, just inches from Elias's polished boots. He leaped back with a yelp of shock and fear. He stared at her, at the smoking barrel of the shotgun, at the unwavering fury in her eyes. He looked at Jim, now pushing himself up onto one knee, and at the small child who still stood guard. He was beaten, not by fists, but by the undeniable reality of the tableau in front of him. A family with a final curse. Elias scrambled back to his horse, mounted with clumsy haste, and spurred the animal into a gallop, fleeing the clearing as if the devil himself were at his heels. Jim, breathing hard, finally got to his feet. Clara lowered the shotgun, her arms trembling from the recoil. Lily ran to Jim, her arms wrapping around his leg. He looked at Clara over the child's head, his face bruised and bloody. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, brilliant strength he had never seen before. The lie he had told to the bounty hunters had just been made true, not by a piece of paper, but by a child's courage and a woman's roar, sealed in the thunder of a shotgun blast. The days following the fight with Elias were steeped in a tense, watchful quiet. The raw violence had passed, but its ghost lingered in the bruised knuckles of Jim's right hand and the dark purple shadow on his jaw. They had won the physical battle, but both he and Clara knew it was merely a skirmish in a larger war. Elias was not a man to accept defeat. They were waiting for his next move, for the law he controlled to come crashing down upon them. Their shared danger had changed the dynamic in the cabin. The awkwardness was gone, burned away by the heat of the confrontation. They were now true partners in a conspiracy, their lives irrevocably intertwined. Clara tended to Jim's wounds with a quiet competence, her touch gentle but sure. He, in turn, watched her with a new intensity, a raw, protective instinct that was no longer just about his past, but about the woman in his present. Lily, having seen her papa defend their home, now orbited him with a fierce, childish loyalty, a constant, innocent reminder of the roles they had been forced to play. The false marriage had become their reality, a fiction they inhabited every waking moment. They were waiting for the arrival of the law, So when they heard the sound of a single horse approaching a week later, they both froze. Inte demasawan. Jim moved to the doorway, his hand instinctively dropping to the colt at his hip. Clara gathered Lily into her arms, her face pale, but this was not Elias. The rider was a lanky youth on a tired-looking horse, a male courier from Cheyenne. He carried a leather satchel, and he looked more interested in a hot meal than a confrontation. Got a letter for a Mr. James Cutter. The boy called out, holding up a sealed envelope. Jim's brow furrowed. Mail was a rarity at his remote cabin. He took the letter, his eyes scanning the official-looking return address, an attorney's office in Esville. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. It was the lawyer he had written 2 weeks ago, the one he had sent a desperate, long-shot letter to, detailing Clara's story. He thanked the courier, who was already turning his horse, eager to be on his way. Jim closed the cabin door, the letter feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand. Clara watched him, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron, her breath held tight in her chest. Everything depended on what was written on the paper inside that envelope. His fingers were not quite steady as he broke the seal. He unfolded the single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal script. Torewarin. He read it once to himself, his expression unreadable. Then he read it again, and a slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in his face. The hard lines of tension around his mouth seemed to soften. "What is it?" Clara whispered, unable to bear the silence any longer. Jim looked up from the letter, and his eyes, those cool, winter sky eyes, held a light she had never seen before. He cleared his throat. "It's from the attorney, a Mr. Granger," he began, his voice low and steady. "He writes that my letter, detailing your testimony, was presented to a circuit judge. It forced the sheriff's office, Elias's office, to reopen the inquiry into Harold Shaw's death." He paused, taking a breath. "They found 2 witnesses, a neighbor who overheard the fights, a doctor who once treated you for a broken wrist from a fall, people who were too scared of the Shaw family to speak before him, but who came forward to the circuit judge." He lifted the paper again. "The official finding has been overturned. The death of Harold Shaw has been ruled an act of self-defense in the face of sustained and life-threatening abuse." Clara stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. Jim's voice grew stronger as he delivered the final, liberating sentences. "The warrant for the arrest of Amelia Shaw is hereby rescinded. All charges have been dropped. In the eyes of the law, ma'am, you are a free woman. Free Cowboy. The word did not compute. For so long, her identity had been defined by its absence. She was a fugitive, a runaway, a hunted animal. The concept of freedom was an abstraction, a country she had never been allowed to enter. Then what went on, the truth of it finally broke through her defenses. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her lips. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto a nearby stool, burying her face in her hands. The tears came, silent and scalding. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a profound, shattering release. It was the unburdening of years of terror, of shame, of the crushing weight of a crime she did not mean to commit. Each tear was a piece of the past being washed away. Jim let her cry. He stood by the table, a silent, steady presence, giving her the space for her grief to finally find its exit. Lily, sensing the shift in the emotional weather, went to her mother and wrapped her small arms around her legs, a gesture of simple, comforting love. After a long while, Clara's sobs subsided. She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes clearer than he had ever seen them. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, Jim retrieved the false marriage license from the almanac. He smoothed out the creases on the table. "This piece of paper," he said quietly, "it was a lie, a necessary one, maybe, but a lie all the same." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Now that you're free, you don't need it. You can be Clara May again. You can go anywhere, build a life. You're not tied to this place, or to me." He was offering her an escape, a true and final freedom from the man who had, in his own way, held her captive with his protection. She looked at the paper. Then around the small, rough-hewn cabin that had been her prison and her sanctuary. She looked at this quiet, scarred man who had stood between her and death. "I've been running for so long. Surely, Jim," she said softly, I think I'm tired of running." I think I'm already where I want to be. A slow smile touched Jim's lips. He pushed the paper across the table toward her. In that case, is there near on this? He said, his voice a low rumble of warmth. Maybe it's time we made this lie tell the truth. Clara looked from the fake marriage license on the table to the earnest, hopeful face of the man who had offered to make it real. The cabin was quiet. The only sounds the soft breathing of her sleeping daughter and the gentle crackle of the fire. In this small, straight, safe room, the world with its laws and judgments felt a universe away. She had been offered a life raft in a storm, and then, once she reached shore, she was being offered a home. She pushed the creased paper back across the table towards him. You don't need a lie to make me stay. Jim, a slow smile, the first genuine, untroubled smile he had ever seen from her, touched her lips. Yes, sir. Noah Sunasaran Rishkun, she whispered. My answer is yes. The word hung in the air, simple and profound. It was not the breathless acceptance of a rescued maiden, but the steady, considered choice of a woman who knew its worth. Jim's shoulders, which had been tense with the weight of his offer, seemed to settle. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. There were no grand declarations, no passionate embraces. There was only a deep, quiet understanding that passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that their long, separate winters were finally over. They decided the wedding would be as simple and honest as the life they intended to build. There would be no church, no crowd, no pretense. It would be theirs, held on the land that had brought them together. The preparations became a new kind of work, a joyful construction. One evening, Clara found Jim not by the woodpile, but by the small forge he used for mending tools and shoeing his horse. He had a fire roaring, and he was hammering a piece of metal on his anvil. The rhythmic clang, iskamin, clang of the hammer was a kind of music. She watched from the doorway as he took a simple, worn horseshoe nail and, with intense concentration, some baker heated it, twisted it, and hammered it into a delicate, rustic loop. He worked the metal for hours, quenching it, polishing it with a piece of leather until the dark iron shone with a soft, muted light. He was not forging a piece of hardware. He was forging a promise, a ring made not of gold or silver, but of the grit and substance of his own world. Clara, for her part, prepared in her own way. On a trip to town, they stopped at Henderson's general store. The couple, Masuri wines, who had once viewed her with suspicion, now greeted them with genuine warmth, pressing a small bag of lemon drops into Lily's hand. While Jim bought flour and beans, Clara quietly purchased a bolt of simple calico cloth, the color of a summer sky. In the evenings, by the firelight, she sewed. Her fingers, which had once trembled with fear, were now steady and sure. She did not fashion a gown of lace and silk, but a simple, practical dress with a clean neckline and a modest skirt. Each stitch was an act of faith, a thread pulling her future together. They were married on a Saturday in late June, when the Wyoming sun was high and warm, and the wildflowers carpeted the meadow in front of an astonished Lily. Their church was a great, ancient oak tree at the edge of the clearing. Their congregation, a handful of people who mattered. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson came, bringing a freshly baked apple pie. Mrs. Gable, Jim's stout cook from the main ranch house, arrived with a jar of her best clover honey. A traveling preacher, a thin, kind-eyed man named Brother Elias, agreed to perform the ceremony. Jim stood waiting under the oak, looking profoundly uncomfortable but deeply happy in a clean shirt. Clara walked toward him, not on the arm of a father, but with Lily holding her hand. She wore her new blue dress, her hair braided with the yellow wildflowers Lily had picked that morning. She looked not like a woman who had been rescued, but like a woman who had come into her own. The preacher's words were simple. He spoke of new beginnings and the grace found in unexpected places. Then it was time for their vows. Jim took Clara's hands in his. Clara, Sir Ewan, he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. I found you in a storm, and I thought I was saving you. I was wrong. Yudley. And Lily, you saved me from a silence that was just as cold. I can't promise you a life without hardship, but I promise I will always be your shield against the wind. I will be your home. Clara's eyes shone with tears. But she did not weep. She squeezed his hands. Shun was for an warranted, she said, her voice clear and strong. I was lost in the dark. A ghost running from other ghosts. You gave me a fire to sit by. You gave me a place to be real. I promised to be the warmth in your home. I promised to be your peace. Jim slid the simple, forged iron ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Lily, standing between them, looked up at their joined hands and beamed. By the authority vested in me by God in the territory of Wyoming, the preacher declared with a smile, I now pronounce you man and wife. He did not need to add, you may kiss the bride. Jim was already leaning down, and he sealed their vow with a kiss that was not filled with the fire of new passion, but with the deep, steady warmth of a hearth that would never again go cold. The seasons turned, and the fierce, but creative, wild beauty of the Wyoming high country softened into the golden light of late summer. The land itself seemed to exhale, releasing the last of the winter's tension. The creek that ran through the lower pasture, once a torrent of melted snow, now murmured a gentle, constant tune. The meadow before the cabin, where Clara had first stood defiant and terrified, was now a tapestry of Indian paintbrush, bluebells, and wild roses she had painstakingly transplanted from the hills. The cabin, once a desperate scar on the landscape, had settled into the earth, its timber walls silvering in the sun. It no longer looked like a shelter, it looked like it belonged. The family that inhabited it had settled just as surely. The silence that had once been Jim Cutter's only companion was now a distant memory, a ghost exorcised by the sound of life. He'd returned from a long day riding the fences of the larger ranch, the familiar ache in his muscles a welcome reminder of a day's hard work. But where he once returned to a crushing emptiness, he now returned to the scent of baking bread on the air. He would see Lily, a flash of blue calico, running from the porch to meet him, her small hand fitting perfectly into his as she chattered about the day's discoveries, a robin's nest, a strange beetle, the way the clouds looked like running horses. Clara would be there on the porch, often in the rocking chair he had built for her, a basket of mending in her lap. She would look up as he approached, and the smile she gave him was a quiet, steady warmth that reached him long before he stepped onto the porch. The haunted, defensive woman was gone, replaced by a confident wife and mother whose laughter was a music he had come to believe he could not live without. One particularly warm afternoon, after the midday meal, Jim brought a long, smooth plank of cedar wood onto the porch. The reddish wood glowed in the sun, and it smelled of the deep forest. He set it across two sawhorses and retrieved his carving tools from a worn leather roll. What are you making? Papa, Lily asked, her curiosity immediate. She peered at the blank, fragrant wood. A proper name, Jim said, his eyes finding Clara's. Every home needs a name. This place needs to know who it belongs to. It's time we put our mark on it for good. He worked all afternoon, and it was a form of worship. The scrape and slice of his tools were a quiet, purposeful sound. He was not a fancy artist, but he was a patient and careful craftsman, and he poured all the feeling he rarely spoke into the task. He sketched the letters first with a piece of charcoal. His large hands, which could wield an axe or gentle a horse, now moving with an artist's focused grace. He was not carving a sign for strangers, but a testament for themselves. Clara sat in her rocking chair. The baby, Samuel, sleeping soundly in a cradle beside her, while Lily watched her father, mesmerized. She saw him carve the letters, deep and clear, into the heart of the wood. The Cutter Ranch, then Datsarazuan, Kadirna. Underneath, Danami and on point, where the grain of the cedar swirled like moving water. He began to carve their initials. He started with his own, Shai, C, and Katia Worm, then carved Clara's, and Kita Tunanikunaiman Warnani Shum. C, Anturchanmine. C. He paused, looking at his wife, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a small, tearful nod of encouragement. Finally, he carved Lily's, oh, C or Nasebar Sarnum. He finished the design with a simple, looping line that wove through the letters like a rope, binding them together forever. When he was finished, he ran his hand over the letters, the wood smooth and alive beneath his calloused palm. There, Wardy of right arm, he said, there wanted they were once, his voice full of a quiet, profound satisfaction. Now the whole world will know. Lily scrambled forward and traced the letters of her own initial with a small, Reverent finger, L.C. She whispered to herself. Lily Cutter, Kuwainash. She looked up at him, her blue eyes, wonders his shows, so like her mother's, shining with a pure, uncomplicated joy. Is that my name forever and ever? Jim knelt, his gaze level with hers, his heart so full he felt it might burst. It always was. Button, if French went on French, he said softly. Right from the very first day, you decided it should be. He stood and fetched his hammer and some nails. Now one husserenar nihina. This is a job for the whole family. He lifted Lily, who giggled with delight, and let her small hand guide the first nail as he gently tapped it into place. He held the sign steady while Clara, her own eyes shining, hammered in the second, then a nenny to one. So, together, they lifted the plank and secured it to the heavy beam above the cabin's front door. It settled into place with a solid, final thud. It was the final piece of their home, the one that gave it its soul. That evening, a profound peace settled over the valley. The three of them sat on the porch, watching as the sun bled colors of orange and purple across the western sky. Lily, tired from the day's excitement, had fallen asleep in her mother's lap, her head resting against Clara's chest. The newly carved sign above them seemed to gather the last of the daylight. Clara leaned her head against Jim's shoulder. Simple iron ring he had forged for her, a familiar weight on her finger. Do you remember telling me that your silence was louder than a blizzard? She murmured. I remember wanting to, he said, his arm tightening around her. It's not anymore, she said. This place, it's full of good sounds now. Lily's laughter. The hammer, the rocking chair, apron. She looked up at him. He had no words for the emotion that swelled in him, so he simply kissed the top of her head. Later, after Lily was tucked into her small bed, Clara sat at the table by the firelight. She opened a new journal, its pages clean and unmarked. The old one, filled with the story of her flight, was put away. On the first page, she wrote, the nib of her pen scratching softly in the quiet room. I came to this place a ghost, hunted and haunted. I thought a home was a fortress, a place to hide from the world. Its only purpose was to keep the storm out. But I was wrong. A home is not a place you defend. It is a place that defends you. Its walls are not made of timber, but of arms that hold you. Its fire is not just for warmth, but for the light you see in a good man's eyes when he looks at your child. My name is Clara Cutter, and I am finally home. She closed the book and joined Jim on the porch. He was looking out at the vast expanse of stars, a universe of cold, distant fires. But he was not cold. He was not distant. He put his arm around her as she settled beside him, and they sat in the comfortable silence that was now the hallmark of their love. They were no longer just survivors. They were founders. Here, in the heart of the wilderness, they had built more than a cabin. They had built a world. If this story stirred something deep within your heart, the whisper of pine on a summer wind, the warmth of a found family, the silent, steady strength of a love that was built, not just discovered, then you have found a home here with us. Here in the rugged beauty of the American West, happiness was not a guarantee. It was a homestead, claimed with courage, cleared with hard labor, and fenced with devotion. It had to be defended from storms, both real and human, and its foundations had to be sunk deep into the bedrock of trust and truth. So, if you believe in quiet cowboys, brave women, and the kind of vows that are carved deeper than timber, then subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. There's another tale waiting just down the trail, another fire waiting to be lit. Hit that bell so you never miss a flicker of love that rises from the dust and the daring. We tell the stories that slow your breath, that make you smile, that might just make you believe again.